The conflict over the Taiwan Strait begins with the story of two parties on the mainland, the Kuomintang, or KMT, and the Communist Party of China, or CPC. Both arose against an old order of land-holding military bureaucrats under successive imperial dynasties, most recently the Qing, a Manchurian dynasty who ruled from 1644 to 1911. Qing rule fused landlord power with an exam-selected bureaucracy that monopolized education and high office. Unlike feudal Europe, early capitalism in China grew chiefly out of these landholding families rather than a separate urban merchant class. This is significant because it gave Chinese efforts to modernize and keep up with the Western colonial powers a profoundly contradictory character. Since the same families could be landlords, merchants, officials, and proto-industrialists, the ruling class sought to pull China in mutually incompatible directions. They spoke of reclaiming the treaty ports seized by Europeans, but without disrupting profit from foreign trade. They wanted factories and railroads, but without draining the labour from the fields. They wanted all of the benefits of Western technique and modernity, without the social upheaval it implied. Though I could go on for a while about the various failed reform campaigns, wars, and unrest of late Qing rule, believe me I want to, the important takeaway is that to those outside the ruling class, the empire offered constant promises of national progress to endless disappointment and growing demoralization. In the absence of rulers capable of leading China against humiliation by foreign imperialists, mass poverty and opium addiction, or towards a higher standard of living and modern culture, urban intellectuals from outside the ruling class emerged as the most radical and influential advocates of Chinese nationalism and modernization. But intellectual reformers had little social weight in themselves, and wrestled with the question of whether to find allies within the old order or the lower classes excluded from it. The Kuomintang was the first of our two parties, with its origins in late Qing secret societies of nationalist intellectuals. Educated in treaty port schools or abroad, many had seen modern states firsthand. Men like Dr. Sun Yat-sen admired Meiji Japan, which had just crushed its feudal landlords to build a modern capitalist empire, and they hoped that the Qing might be similarly transformed from above. But by the beginning of the 20th century, they were growing impatient. The arch-conservative Empress Dowager Cixi had vetoed reforms for decades, but recently she had allowed one to go through. By allowing young, unlanded intellectuals to become officers in the Qing army, she unwittingly laid the basis for the Xinhai Revolution of 1911. Young nationalist officers declared a revolt to overthrow the emperor, but their uprising remained primarily a military mutiny, not a social revolution that mobilized the popular classes. As Qing forces under General Yuan Shikai regained ground, Sun cut a deal. Yuan could lead a republic if he overthrew the emperor. The Qing fell, but the bargain backfired. Yuan soon assassinated his rivals in the Republic and crowned himself emperor, and after a brief, inept reign, left China in shards. Landlords, industrialists, politicians and gangs all lost faith in a centralized state and raised private armies to protect their local territory, becoming warlords. The revolution had fractured old China without replacing it with a new one. Sun and his allies founded the Kuomintang to keep reform alive, but his efforts to unite the supposedly liberal southern warlords failed, leaving the new party isolated amid the spreading chaos. Yet the nationalist intelligentsia was not yet a spent force. In 1917, the northern warlords in control of China's vestigial republican government committed the country to the First World War, sending hundreds of thousands of Chinese labourers into the mud of the Western Front. Many expected that in return, the Treaty of Versailles would return Germany's possessions in China. Instead, they were given to Japan. Japan had long preyed on China. From 1894, it had taken Korea and Taiwan from the dying Qing Empire. With the Republic collapsing, it saw new chances to seize territory, labour and resources to fuel its own burgeoning empire. Versailles, and evidence of government officials taking Japanese bribes, ignited a new nationalism. The May 4th movement differed from the secret societies that had overthrown the Qing. It was a street movement and youth counterculture that activated students and mobilised port city workers. In this climate, intellectuals like Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao concluded that the old order couldn't be reformed from above and had to be overthrown through an alliance with the workers and peasants. Amid reports of Bolshevik successes in Russia, they came to believe that a communist movement could achieve national liberation and modernization where reformers like Sun Yat-sen had failed. The Kuomintang and communists had very different methods and goals, so it may seem odd that soon after both were formed, they forged an alliance, the First United Front. Several factors drove this. Though Dr. Sun Yat-sen was tainted by his deal with Yuan Shikai and the failed Xinhai Revolution, he retained prestige, and many communists believed that he was moving left, disillusioned with the old elite and open to a workers' and peasants' mass party to overthrow the worst of the old order by force. Many Chinese communists and their Bolshevik advisors also held a stagist view of history. China must first overthrow feudalism with progressive bourgeois leaders like Sun before socialist revolution could be possible. By 1923, Moscow, seeking diplomatic security amid its isolation, also saw Sun as a stronger potential ally than the still small CPC. The CPC thought it could win Sun's followers to their ideas, and the Kuomintang thought it could control the CPC and gain Soviet weapons and advisors. The final agreement was quite favourable to Sun, with CPC members putting themselves under the discipline of the Kuomintang's existing leadership. Both parties also created a joint military, the National Revolutionary Army, trained by Soviet generals to overthrow the warlords and reunify China. The NRA quickly became one of China's strongest forces, swelling both parties' ranks, but fissures soon opened. By Sun's death in 1925, an anti-communist faction in the Kuomintang sought to expel the CPC to protect Chinese capital from its growing influence. Despite the Kuomintang's new leftist rhetoric, a hard social distinction between progressive bourgeois leaders and the old landholders was always an ideological fiction, and the Kuomintang soon became entangled in the same inter-elite patronage networks as the warlords. A left nationalist faction around Wang Jinwei briefly seemed poised to succeed Sun. But in March 1926, the right forced Wang to resign and arrested CPC supporters in Guangzhou. A new leader emerged, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang, the son of salt merchants, received a foreign education and came to hate the Qing for their backwardness and weakness. He fought in 1911 and, in the chaotic years that followed, became tied to organised crime in Shanghai. His loyalties thereafter became split between Sun Yat-sen, the Hongmen secret society, and the criminal syndicate known as the Green Gang. Having gained a military education in Japan, he led the Soviet-backed Whampoa Military Academy and became one of the Kuomintang's best generals, hailed by Soviet media despite his growing anti-communism. By 1925, his influence in the military, secret societies and underworld made him the right's preferred leader, while his Soviet prestige kept arms and funding flowing. Even after using martial law to sideline the left and the CPC in Guangzhou, he was still able to leverage the firm support of Joseph Stalin, now a major Soviet leader, to dispel any fears that he was about to move against the communists. The First United Front was heading for disaster. Though the CPC had largely suspended calls for immediate social revolution, many organisers ignored Comintern and Kuomintang directives to confine demonstrations, strikes and land seizures to approved limits. CPC organisers like Peng Pai or his follower Mao Zedong helped poor peasants build free associations on expropriated land. They avoided targeting pro-Kuomintang landlords, but peasants ruling themselves nonetheless alarmed the southern landlords backing Chiang. Meanwhile, port city workers launched crippling strikes against foreign trade, hurting Kuomintang financiers as much as imperial interests. Chiang and his Comintern advisors tried to rein in unrest and aim it at their warlord enemies. The NRA surged north, backed by peasant and worker uprisings and strikes. The Northern Expedition was highly successful for Chiang. It bound the CPC closer and paralysed his foes by striking at their economic base. But workers and peasants repeatedly refused to limit strikes and expropriations to foreign imperialists and anti-Chiang warlords. The Kuomintang and CPC denounced them as premature and ultra-left, to little effect. A second Chinese revolution loomed, threatening even the pro-Kuomintang landlords and industrialists. 1927 was the breaking point between the Kuomintang and the CPC. Chiang's armies neared Shanghai, China's largest industrial port, host to multiple foreign concessions, and stronghold of both the Chinese working class and Chiang's Green Gang allies. As he advanced, communists planned strikes and demonstrations for February 19th under slogans like Hail Chiang and Support the National Revolutionary Army. Organisers were told to spare KMT-linked firms and coordinate with Chiang's allies. After 2 days, warlord troops attacked. CPC leaders Chen Duxiu and Zhou Enlai called for an armed uprising. To Chiang, however, this looked like insubordination. He paused his advance, hoping the warlord soldiers would crush the workers. Instead, the strike swelled. On March 21st, a larger, better organised movement seized much of the city and set up workers' councils. When Chiang's forces entered on March 26, the city was already in communist hands. He told workers the councils were no longer necessary and ordered their disarmament. Some CPC members even helped. Over the next 2 weeks, he assembled loyal military, police and gang forces, and on April 12th, he finally struck. The Shanghai Massacre, killed thousands in shootings and public beheadings. For weeks, the CPC and Comintern refused to believe that Chiang had turned on them. He had been their Red General, emblem of a progressive anti-imperialist bourgeois leader. But 5,000 to 10,000 workers lay dead at his feet. On April 21st, Stalin wrote in Pravda, "The line of the close cooperation of the left-wingers and the communists within the Kuomintang, and the consolidation of the unity of the Kuomintang, of making use of the right, of their connections and their experiences so far as they submitted to the discipline of the Kuomintang, the events which followed have fully and entirely proved the correctness of this line." By the end of April, the Comintern finally admitted Chiang was not an ally. It nonetheless claimed the United Front survived via Wang Jinwei's left KMT government in Wuhan, where fleeing communists regrouped until Wang purged them that summer. Between Shanghai, Wuhan, and countryside crackdowns on peasant communes, roughly 25,000 communists were killed in months, over 85% of the party's members. The White Terror then engulfed workers and peasants suspected of opposition, with poorly documented rural killings numbering in the hundreds of thousands. After the Shanghai massacre, the CPC Kuomintang alliance was finally dead, though only Chen Duxiu openly called the front a mistake. But instead of going underground to rebuild, the CPC launched an offensive to revive a revolution already strangled in its crib. Uprisings in Nanchang and Guangzhou failed to spread. Peng Pai led a rural revolt with the survivors and local peasants, but it lasted only 4 months. By late 1927, the original urban-based CPC was all but dead. A rump central committee in Shanghai safe houses and a force of rural guerrillas in the Hunan Jiangxi borderlands that had fallen out of regular contact. Its leader was Mao Zedong. Mao, the son of petty landowners in Hunan, received the traditional Confucian education. His study of Western thought was largely self-directed. He was still in middle school in 1911, yet joined the Revolutionary Army. As a university librarian in the late 1910s, he met the founders of the Communist Party, but initially embraced anarchism. Still eclectic, he joined the party at its founding. He stood on the right of the party, arguing strongly in favour of the Kuomintang alliance, but was left on peasant issues. After Chiang's betrayal and the party's decision to go on the offensive, he led the new Chinese Workers' and Peasants' Red Army in the failed Autumn Harvest Uprising. His attack on Changsha was a poorly organised disaster. The Kuomintang then executed thousands of Hunanese peasants. After retreating to Jiangxi and adopting guerrilla tactics, Mao was branded a rogue, an opportunist red bandit, and was demoted for failing to build urban support and recruiting rural criminals. This wasn't wrong, but he was working with what he had. After the failed uprising and his demotion, Mao had reached his lowest point, and was depressed and disillusioned. From his base in the Jinggan Mountains, however, Mao slowly rebuilt by recruiting local miners and bandits. With little else left, the CPC readmitted him and ordered another Hunan uprising. It predictably failed, and on retreating to the Jinggan Mountains he found Chiang's forces already there. His troops were forced to wander the mountains, starving and fighting along the way. Mao's second wife and sister were captured and executed by Kuomintang generals. He contracted tuberculosis, and his allies on the Central Committee were replaced by Moscow's puppets. Soon after, a left-wing faction of his troops mutinied, and Mao's supporters tortured and executed between 1,000 and 3,000 of his men. It was another low, but he survived, and established a base in Jiangxi, which the CPC proclaimed an independent Soviet republic in 1931. Mao always urged guerrilla tactics, but the Central Committee insisted on open fighting and territorial control, hoping a visible stand would spark wider uprisings, but it merely exposed the remaining communists. Despite controlling most of China and attacking from all sides, Chiang's generals were beaten in 4 encirclement attempts. Frustrated, Chiang took command and, with German specialists, built a ring of fortifications, trenches, bunkers and barbed wire, a tightening noose to starve the communists. The tactics worked. The communists were in a crisis. Even with a peasant army of 140,000 men, they lost thousands in failed breakouts. In October 1934, they began the Long March. The entire Red Army would find a weak spot in the fortifications and punch through to safety with its entire strength. 86,000 men began the assault, but only 36,000 made it through the lines, including Mao and most of the leaders. Only 7,000 made it to the final destination in the mountains of Yunnan, a crushing defeat. But Mao again survived despite the odds, and after the Zunyi Conference, with rivals dead or isolated, he increasingly emerged as the CPC's leader. While Chiang was focused on defeating the communists, Japan once again looked to a weakened China to seize resources for its growing war machine. It had taken Manchuria in 1931, which Chiang considered expendable. By 1936, Japan was preparing a larger push, and many felt Chiang was ignoring the threat to better pursue the communists into Yunnan. Not all of his generals agreed, including his northern ally Zhang Shuiliang. He had overseen and now regretted the retreat from Manchuria. At a December 1936 meeting where Chiang urged another anti-communist campaign, Zhang made a stunning move. He had Chiang arrested and demanded a united front with the communists against Japan. Another alliance was not a new proposal, but Mao and the CPC were skeptical after 1927. Stalin, who distrusted Mao but admired Chiang, denounced Zhang and insisted on Chiang's release on condition that he lead an anti-Japanese army. Zhou Enlai was sent to negotiate, and after exhausting all other options, Chiang agreed to a second united front. A deeply embittered Chiang put Zhang under house arrest for the next 55 years, believing that he had cost him a final victory over the communists in 1936. Although Stalin had wanted Mao to submit to Chiang's authority as Generalissimo, Mao wasn't an idiot and knew that real subordination would be a death sentence. When Japan attacked in 1937, the Kuomintang and CPC collaborated within the NRA, but never fully merged commands as in the 1920s. Mutual distrust made the Second United Front an uneasy truce, and real coordination broke down by 1938. After 4 years of war, the Communists proved tactically and politically more effective than the corrupt Kuomintang, and Chiang again came to fear Mao more than Japan. In the new Fourth Army incident of January 1941, the truce collapsed. Taiwanese and mainland historians debate to this day who fired first, but it was the Communists who lost more men, and were more successful in offering evidence of betrayal that rallied popular sympathy. Many condemned the Nationalists for breaking the United Front, and though they strengthened their positions in the south against the Communists, by the end of the war they had lost considerable support. Nonetheless, by Japan's defeat, the Kuomintang had received most Allied aid and controlled most of China. During the war, Mao had drifted from Stalin. The 1941 Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact limited Moscow's help, and from 1942 to 44, Mao isolated most pro-Soviet elements in the party. When the USSR seized Manchuria in 1945, relations were still bad. Stalin again leaned towards Chiang, signing a friendship treaty in August 1945. He considered Mao an ultra-left, a cave Marxist, and sent agents to push another alliance with Chiang. Mao successfully outpoliticked them. It was the United States that finally pushed Stalin to reconsider Mao as an asset. The US had backed Chiang in the aftermath of Japan's surrender, landing 50,000 Marines to secure coastal cities and supervise their handover to the KMT. Stalin attempted to come to an agreement with President Truman, with both supporting a Popular Front government in which both Mao and Chiang would have a seat at the table. To every leader in China, however, this was unworkable, since neither side was willing to give up control of their militaries. Stalin was finally forced to admit that the United Front was dead, and agreed to give Mao limited support. The Soviets evacuated Manchuria and left Japanese-built arsenals and factories to equip the Red Army, giving Mao a real industrial base for the looming war against Chiang. In June 1946, the intermittent truce between Mao and Chiang collapsed. Chiang's forces, equipped with surplus US weapons, surged north in an offensive that seemed set to finish the CPC for good. The next year, the tide turned. Mao had gained firmer backing from Stalin, who began sending limited supplies, and had moreover begun promising the peasants more serious land reforms if he won. Chiang also severely mismanaged the southern economy, leading to hyperinflation that lost him much of his support in the Chinese urban centres. US aid was also briefly paused amid fears Kuomintang corruption would waste it, and while negotiations for a Popular Front government were considered. Over the next 3 years, Chiang suffered steady defeats as communist armies and peasant uprisings pushed south. By April 1949, the Red Army reached the Yangtze, the last barrier before the KMT centres of power at Nanjing and Shanghai. Stalin wasn't quite done with his love affair with Chiang, and made one last appeal to Mao to end the war and form a coalition government with the Kuomintang, but Mao refused. Within days, his troops crossed the river, and Chiang evacuated first to Guangzhou, then Taiwan. With the Kuomintang exiled, the CPC proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. Chiang's evacuation to Taiwan in December 1949 is often taken as the war's end, but it really wasn't. The Kuomintang had left the eastern mainland, yet their navy, pre-war vessels and surplus Allied ships patrolled the coast, seizing or sinking vessels suspected of trading with the communists. Besides Taiwan, they held the Zhoushan Islands near Shanghai, the Dachens off Taizhou, the Matsus off Fuzhou, the Kinmens near Xiamen, and Hainan off the south coast. From these bases, the navy and irregulars recruited from pirate crews could block key ports, hoping to starve the mainland and enable Chiang's return. Nor had all mainland forces surrendered. Chiang's Muslim allies fought on in the far west for 8 years. Kuomintang remnants in Burma launched an insurgency across the border, financing themselves as linchpins of the global opiate trade. In Tibet, ultra-conservative aristocrats and monks had broken away after 1911. The newly renamed People's Liberation Army spent much of the 1950s slowly retaking these areas. Where was the United States in all this? Globally, the US pursued containment of Soviet-aligned forces, but on the China question, its leaders were divided over the early 1950s. Hawks like General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Arthur Radford urged maximum military pressure on Mao, urging the funding of the Kuomintang and even nuclear strikes. Others were reluctant to support Chiang. General George C. Marshall called the Kuomintang both hopelessly corrupt and fascist in character. Some hoped Mao would split from Stalin, as Yugoslavia's Tito had, forming a useful buffer. Britain, which dominated the China trade, lobbied Washington not to aid the Kuomintang, since it now backed pirates threatening British shipping. The newly formed CIA urged the most prescient course of action. By covertly supporting Chiang's blockade of China, the US could achieve all of its objectives without alienating its allies with the prospect of another major war. A deepened blockade would force China to turn to the USSR for more aid and trading links. They had observed the often tense and unequal relationship between Stalin and Mao's governments, and concluded that the more that they were forced to interact, the rockier their relations would become. A 1948 CIA report noted that, when the issue of subservience to Moscow has become more immediate than that of US imperialism, Chinese nationalism will prove stronger than international communism. In 1952, it added, the Chinese communists might make demands upon the USSR, or even take action incompatible with long-range Soviet global interests. Frictions might arise because of Soviet inability or disinclination to supply capital equipment, and China might resent the idea of a communist world dominated from Moscow. The CIA was also thinking in terms of a long-term defensive strategy against threats from mainland Asia, the idea that would later become known as the island chain strategy. The line of archipelagos running from Japan to the Philippines forms a natural defensive line, which if compromised at any one point, would weaken all of the other strongholds. In March 1949, a CIA report noted that reinforcing Taiwan would strengthen the will to resist communism in Japan, in Korea, in the Philippines, and elsewhere throughout the Far East. Truman's National Security Council readily adopted the idea, calling Taiwan part of its first line of strategic defense in Asia. In November, the State Department noted that Taiwan was geographically defensible, but worried about Chiang's leadership, noting that a spiritual regeneration was needed if Taiwan was to survive as an independent polity. The department was still worried that the Kuomintang would be, in Secretary of State Dean Acheson's words, so corrupt and incompetent at governing Taiwan that the island might fall on its own. Fears of a PRC invasion of Taiwan grew after the PLA took Hainan and the Zhoushan Islands in 1950, though it failed to take Dardan Islet in the Kinmens. China's entry into the Korean War proved decisive. The Chinese volunteer army's effectiveness marked the PRC as a greater threat, and Truman sought new ways to apply pressure on Mao. The same month Chinese forces crossed into Korea, the CIA began covert aid to the Kuomintang-aligned pirate navy in the Dachens. Advisors were also sent to Taiwan itself. Publicly, Truman pledged to stop invasion fleets from both sides, using the US Navy to block attacks both ways. This pretense of neutrality was dropped by the incoming Eisenhower administration, which sided with hawkish generals to unleash Chiang, openly arming the Kuomintang Navy and pirates to enforce a total blockade of Chinese shipping. British traders were outraged, but the US's Pacific allies, particularly Australia and New Zealand, were extremely supportive. Except for Britain, US allies upheld sanctions on the PRC, hindering its recovery from the Civil War. As the CIA intended, this deepened its costly dependence on the USSR. The blockade, now significantly sustained by US-built aircraft, helped push Mao towards a ceasefire in Korea. Though the blockade was proving effective, the end of the Korean War also meant the PRC could redeploy forces south to the Taiwan Strait. Chiang shifted thousands of troops to the Kinmen and Matsu Islands. Each side feared invasion, but neither had the means. The Kuomintang lacked troops, the PRC lacked a navy. Beijing instead chose to peel back Taiwan's offshore defensive line. In September 1954, the PLA shelled Kinmen. In November, it struck the Dachshunds from the air. In January 1955, it seized the Yijianshan Islands, 2 rocks guarding Taizhou Harbour, in a coordinated combined arms assault. Washington panicked. The Senate swiftly passed the Formosa Resolution, authorizing Eisenhower to deploy US forces to defend Taiwan. Yet the US would not fight for every offshore islet. US advisors urged Chiang to abandon exposed positions and focus on Taiwan and the offshore islands guarding major harbours like the Kinmens and Matsus. In Operation King Kong, the US Navy helped evacuate the Dachshunds, seen to be compromised after Yijianshan fell. Chiang didn't want to lose any more ground, and he ordered defences on the remaining islands to dig in. US generals pressed Eisenhower to consider preemptive nuclear strikes on PLA positions in Fujian, and US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles openly said the option was on the table. The brinkmanship worked. By May 1, 1955, the artillery duels and bombings of the islands eased. The first Taiwan Strait crisis had ended, but its causes remained, and another clash was inevitable. In the aftermath, the US stepped up aid to Taiwan, granting surplus ships, artillery and jet fighters. China likewise turned to the USSR, but by 1956, its debts to the Kremlin had reached between $1 and $2 billion. Despite efforts by Nikita Khrushchev to apologize for Stalin's unfair dealings with China, relations with Mao were clearly getting worse. Mao resented Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies from 1956, as well as his handling of the Hungarian Revolution. De-Stalinization undermined leaders like Mao, who derived their legitimacy from perceived Stalinist orthodoxy, nor did the Soviets match US nuclear threats in the first crisis. Faced with China's sluggish growth and over-reliance on the USSR, Mao had turned to increasingly voluntarist economic policies, collectively known as the Great Leap Forward. Superhuman effort and ideological conviction would succeed where careful Soviet-style 5-year plans had failed. As shortages from mismanagement began, Soviet debt payments proved an easy scapegoat. As the CIA predicted in 1948, the blockade hastened a growing Sino-Soviet split, opening up the possibility that the US might one day appear the lesser evil. With famine looming, breaking the Guomindang blockade became even more urgent. Kinmen's garrisons prevented trade between Xiamen and British shipping via Hong Kong and Singapore. In August 1958, the PLA tested these offshore defences, seeking to repeat Yijianshan with a strike on the tiny islet of Dongding, guarding the approach to Xiamen. The attack failed. After 2 inconclusive naval battles between small craft, the PLA withdrew. It nonetheless triggered panic in Washington. The US even signalled readiness to use nuclear weapons to defend the islets. As intermittent PRC shelling began and 750,000 mainland troops faced 80,000 nationalists, the US escalated support. 203mm howitzers, which it noted could fire nuclear rounds, large jet deployments, and naval escorts for convoys. Under Operation Black Magic, Taiwanese F-86 fighters received experimental AIM-9 Sidewinders, scoring some of the first air-to-air missile kills. Despite strongly considering the option, the US declined a preemptive strike, fearing the Soviet response and seeing no imminent PRC invasion. PLA bombardment was proving insufficient to stop resupply to the islands. Washington pressed Chiang to pull back some forces so Beijing could claim a face-saving victory. In return, Chiang was given even better US equipment, like 240mm super heavy guns, spy planes, and early surface-to-air missiles. The blockade on the mainland eased, and Beijing agreed to shell only on odd-numbered days, letting nationalist convoys through. The artillery duel became mostly symbolic, propaganda leaflets mixed with occasional high-explosive rounds, and lasted until 1979, with only 200 deaths over the next 20 years. Kinmen accumulated so much spent metal that locals started a cottage industry making chef's knives from unexploded rounds. While the PRC and Republic of China never signed an armistice, the tempo of military engagements dropped off considerably after 1958. The PRC shelled Kinmen heavily in 1959 after a nationalist round hit a nursery on Dading, killing 31 children, and again during Eisenhower's 1960 visit. But it never attempted serious plans to take either Taiwan or the offshore islands, as its attempts to build an invasion fleet were repeatedly delayed. In Taiwan, however, Chiang Kai-shek was far more serious about plans to launch an amphibious invasion of the mainland, hoping to be supported by the US in order to cut off the Chinese supply routes into Vietnam. Commando raids, spy plane overflights, and naval probing escalated over the early 1960s, with plans to use Kinmen as a base to seize Xiamen, but frustrated by US reluctance, Chiang ordered Project National Glory, an absurd plan for a solo invasion. But naval probes failed, costing 3 warships over 1965, and the project was delayed indefinitely. In 1967, the last air battle saw Taiwanese F-104s down 2 mainland MiG-19s for 1 loss. Afterward, there were no further battles beyond the routine shelling. With the Civil War easing after 1950, both sides gained breathing room to build working civilian economies and state apparatuses to support their huge militaries. Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek remained under permanent martial law. Unauthorized parties and newspapers were banned. The Mandarin-speaking Weisheng-ren, those who arrived in 1949, monopolized most military and bureaucratic posts. Hokkien-speaking Bengsheng-ren, the pre-1949 residents of Taiwan, were largely excluded. Mainland criminal networks shattered by the revolution reconstituted in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and new syndicates such as the Bamboo Union and Four Seas Gang gained influence. Despite having been founded by refugee landlords, crime bosses and industrialists, you might be surprised to hear that the new state pursued sweeping land redistribution, nationalizations, and state-led development. These hurt local elites in the short term, but were deemed necessary by the Kuomintang and US advisors to stabilize the economy and break up the big inefficient estates. Once the statized economy had created a sounder basis for private development, Taiwan became a kind of labor emporium for international capital, a massively export-oriented economy founded on offering manufacturing labor at bargain prices. Many in the Taiwanese working class, disproportionately women, were kept in barracks-like compounds, while men were conscripted. State education meant that this workforce was not only cheap, but highly educated, and between this and US technical aid, the Taiwanese economy eventually began to specialize in high-tech light industry. Technology transfer meant that domestic capital was able to start high-tech businesses of its own, and by the 1980s, Taiwanese capital had grown exceedingly wealthy on the backs of the mainly Bengsheng-ren working class. On the mainland, the CPC had initially pursued economic policies that were arguably less radical than those pursued on Taiwan. Mao had won the Civil War in part by appealing to nationalist sentiment across all classes disaffected by the corruption and mismanagement of the Kuomintang, and as such the new communist leaders didn't immediately pursue drastic social changes. During the New Democracy period of 1949 to the early 1950s, Mao adapted the old stagist view to argue that China needed a period of capitalist and democratic development before socialism could be pursued. Thus the CPC would not rule alone, but atop a coalition of parties of the peasantry, small business owners, and any capitalists who oppose the nationalists. Evidence of this cross-class coalitionist spirit is actually still evident in the PRC flag. Expropriations would be limited to only those landlords and capitalists who met the criteria of being corrupt, wasteful, over-bureaucratic or Kuomintang supporters. Like many popular frontist leaders of his era, Mao hoped that by presenting a moderate image as merely an anti-imperialist nationalist, he could elicit foreign sympathy and enable China to normalize trade and technology transfers with the outside world. It was Chinese class society itself that made more moderate policies unviable. The bourgeoisie was not going to work with a force calling itself a communist party clearly aligned with the Soviets. The peasants were not going to delay collectivizing their land just to avoid antagonizing the remaining landlords. And the workers were not going to limit their expropriations to only the so-called enemy property holders, just as they hadn't in 1927. By legalizing the expropriation of anyone accused of being corrupt or a Kuomintang agent, Mao had actually created the conditions by which almost any capitalist could have their property confiscated if enough workers pointed the finger at them. By 1952, this legalistic form of expropriation through accusations of criminality had fundamentally transformed the economy. The new China was not going to be a capitalist state, even if Mao and the CPC rather wished that it would be, at least until things stabilized. By 1953, the CPC de-emphasized the pretense of the bourgeois Democratic Popular Front government. China became a party state, transitioning to socialism, modelled on the USSR. Planning never reached Soviet scale, but 5-year plans and large Soviet advisory missions drove one of the biggest transfers of expertise and equipment in history. By 1953, most landlords were stripped of holdings and, by 1956, farms were collectivized. Large and medium industry was nationalized. Literacy and anti-poverty campaigns advanced rapidly. Many peasants saw the first sustained rise in living standards in centuries. At the 8th Party Congress, Mao declared socialism was being achieved and promised a gradual transition to a classless, stateless democratic society. The 100 Flowers campaign loosened state censorship. Mao expected little but praise, but he was in for a surprise. The intellectuals were outraged at the centralization of leadership since 1953, as was to be expected. But even the Chinese working class seemed to be turning against him. The nationalisation of industry had actually reduced their wages in some sectors, and in 1957, workers in the port cities undertook large strikes. The situation was worryingly evocative of what had happened in Hungary the year before, and the CPC panicked, imprisoning the intellectuals in a crackdown known as the Anti-Rightist Campaign and prosecuting the strikers as petty criminals. The following year, Mao's experimentation with a policy of centralising the collective farms and national food rationing, combined with over-reporting of food stockpiles and pseudo-scientific agricultural practices, initiated a period of mass famine that would last until 1962. Estimates are too politicised to be reliable, but deaths were quite plausibly above 15 million. The 1950s had seen extraordinary steps forward for the PRC and a leap backward, which now threatened a leadership crisis in the party. Some, like Peng Dehuai, Mao's best general, criticised policies openly and were purged. Others, like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, moved carefully, hoping Mao would accept a role as a charismatic figurehead, while steadier bureaucrats ran the state. They quietly reversed famine-inducing policies to let Mao save face, but Mao was worried. These were bureaucrats of the Soviet type. They had little ideology beyond whatever seemed likely to allow the party state to survive for another few years. Mao turned to the party youth and university students, warning them of a growing bureaucratization that threatened the revolution. While the Cultural Revolution saw moments which threatened to inject genuine workers' democracy into a dying Chinese revolution, like the ultralefts in the Shanghai Commune, the overall effect of those years was to allow Mao to redirect youth anger to target his enemies within the party bureaucracy, creating a climate of fear and random violence conducted by the PLA and student paramilitaries. By then, the PRC had broken with the Soviet bloc, denouncing the USSR as fascist and urging defections to a Chinese-led camp. Only Albania joined. Attempts to woo Vietnam and North Korea faltered, and China soon felt encircled by Soviet allies. Border clashes with the USSR escalated in 1969, and Beijing dropped much of its support for Vietnam. Cut off from Soviet expertise and disrupted by the Cultural Revolution, the economy needed new foreign partners. The Nixon administration offered a surprising lifeline. Nixon desperately wanted to reduce American defense spending in the Asia-Pacific region. The depletion of gold reserves associated with constant wars in Southeast Asia had brought the US and its allies to the verge of economic collapse. If China could be turned into an anti-Soviet buffer, as some in the CIA and State Department had hoped since the 1940s, the US could shift its focus to outcompeting the Soviets in Europe, leaving the Asia-Pacific to mostly manage its own affairs. US sanctions and travel restrictions were relaxed from 1969, and in 1971 it supported China in gaining a seat on the Security Council alongside Taiwan. In the actual UN vote, a counter-proposal to also strip Taiwan of its seat won out. Over the next 8 years, the US scaled down almost all of its support to the ROC. To Chiang Kai-shek, this was an unimaginable betrayal, but the fact was that a deal with Mao had a better chance of neutralizing Beijing as a threat than Chiang's delusional invasion plans. As Mao lay dying after years of turmoil, Deng Xiaoping rebuilt his power and emerged as China's paramount leader in 1978. He inherited a state where voluntarism had papered over widening gaps with rival powers. His response was reform and opening up, re-exposing China to seaborne trade and technology. This was less a complete rupture with Mao than an exaggeration of his late-period diplomacy. It was Mao who had split with Moscow, normalized ties with the US, and sought European and Japanese investment after 1972. Under Deng, the realignment deepened into military action against common enemies in Vietnam and Cambodia, and stronger economic links. The US de-recognized Taiwan in 1979, and special economic zones in port cities lured foreign manufacturers with cheap, unregulated Chinese labor and real estate. Incidentally, this was another example of the PRC and Taiwan pursuing almost exactly the same economic policies for different reasons. But while the PRC was successful in normalizing relations with the US, it couldn't yet do the same with the Kuomintang dictatorship. The entire edifice of its state institutions had been built on the idea of one day retaking the mainland, and while the generation that had fled to the island in 1949 was still in charge, normalization would be impossible. Chiang Kai-shek's son and third president of Taiwan, Chiang Ching-kuo, declared in 1979 that there would be no contact, no negotiation, and no compromise with Beijing. The problem for Kuomintang hardliners was that there was now serious money to be made on the mainland. With wages rising in Taiwan as state-run unions expanded in the 1970s, manufacturers sought cheaper labour. Although the Kuomintang tried to block mainland investment, capital found workarounds through Hong Kong. Under pressure to allow cross-strait travel, Jiang Qingguo relented in 1987, approving family visits that often doubled as business trips. A distinct class of investors with mainland interests emerged, the Taishang, or in CPC terminology, compatriot businessmen. Beijing's bureaucracy had long seen that drawing in Taiwanese capital could soften political differences and ease a path to peaceful reunification. The strategy worked at first, fueling calls in Taiwan to normalise relations. If the Taishang were cooperating with the mainland for mutual benefit, what purpose did a dictatorship built to protect Taiwanese capital from the mainland still serve? Jiang Qingguo's death in 1988 led to an unexpected successor. Li Denghui was Beng Shenren, a pre-1949 resident, a Japanophile academic with past ties to communists, sympathetic to Taiwanese nationalism, and a liberal democrat, everything that would have made Chiang Kai-shek roll in his grave. Yet under Jiang Qingguo, elite Beng Shenren had built support inside the Kuomintang. Li also knew how to navigate black gold politics, the leveraging of organised criminal patronage networks common to Taiwanese power struggles. Having overcome the conservative palace faction, he moved to mark himself as a reformer. Martial law had softened a year earlier, and Li pushed further. He filled government posts with Beng Shenren colleagues, and conceded to student pro-democracy protesters in 1990. In 1994, he announced Taiwan's first free presidential election for 1996. The mainland had of course experienced its own student protests months before Taiwan's. In 1989, Tiananmen Square brought together students and workers. The former pressed for democratization and free expression, the latter protested the harsh economic realities of marketization on wages and benefits. The reformist right, like Premier Zhao Ziyang, wanted to accelerate both economic and political liberalization. Conservative leftists, including many PLA generals, argued for a temporary halt to both. Deng Xiaoping preferred to balance both sides, but chose to defend the party state with a crackdown. The PLA crushed the protests, ending immediate prospects for change, both to the left and right of the party. With Zhao Ziyang under house arrest and Deng Xiaoping in semi-retirement due to his age, party leadership fell to Jiang Zemin, the first PRC leader with no role in the revolutions or civil war. An engineer and economic manager, he had kept out of political storms and accumulated few enemies. As Shanghai mayor, he was known for avoiding dramatic moves, but 1989 revealed his one clear skill. While Beijing's protests ended in bloodshed, Shanghai's ended through cooptation and de-escalation. The party leadership concluded that Jiang's skill at settling disputes without altering policy was useful amidst the aftermath of Tiananmen. More importantly, Jiang's low profile let the factions to his left and right set the real agenda. For 2 years, he slowed reform while offering empty assurances. In 1992, however, Deng publicly hinted that liberalization was too slow. Jiang saw that his political survival required decisive shifts, one of which involved Taiwan. The situation had reversed from a decade earlier. Taiwan now wanted closer ties, and it was the PRC that dragged its feet. Jiang Zemin read Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern Tour as a green light to open the PRC to unprecedented foreign investment. Taiwan was seeing record capital outflows, and its electronics firms eyed the mainland's southern coastal cities. Jiang moved to welcome them, drafting special protections for Taiwanese capital enacted in 1994. This served both the CPC's liberalization and national security aims, knitting Taiwan to the mainland. But the ties had side effects. Taiwanese workers saw jobs move to cheaper mainland labour, and came to view Kuomintang outreach as greed and disloyalty to Taiwan's identity. Many gravitated to left nationalist groups like the Democratic Progressive Party. The CPC now found itself in the position of having courted Taiwan's bourgeoisie at the expense of its working class. Li Denghui, though sympathetic to Taiwanese separatism, had accepted the compromise principle of one China, two interpretations in 1992, agreeing to reunification in principle while differing on its terms. Yet growing Taiwanese reliance on investment in the mainland worried him. As Jiang courted Taiwanese investors, Li offered subsidies to steer capital to Southeast Asia. Even as talks continued, Taipei launched a broad lobbying push at the UN and in Washington to raise the ROC's international recognition. This jockeying over Taiwan's economic and political future set the stage for the sharp downturn in relations the next year. Seeking to normalise Taiwan's international standing, in 1995 Lee pursued a US visit, the first since before Nixon's rapprochement with Beijing. He likely expected PRC protests, but judged them manageable while Beijing still sought to woo Taiwanese capital. The Clinton administration, already overloaded with interventions in Haiti, Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq and Rwanda, wanted no new crisis. Clinton had imposed tighter sanctions on China, largely to appeal to liberal humanitarian outrage at Tiananmen Square, but these were largely scrapped in 1994, as it was, in the words of the secretary overseeing them, the equivalent of holding a gun to your head and threatening to pull the trigger. US manufacturers were increasingly tied to China. Even so, some $5 million in Taiwanese lobbying money was floating around Congress at the time, and the House soon forced Clinton's hand. Lee would visit as a private citizen to give a speech at Cornell University, assuring the White House that it would be a low-key affair. Beijing was angry even before Lee's speech, as the White House failed to uphold a promise to veto the visit entirely. The content made it much worse. Lee used the phrase Republic of China government on Taiwan 17 times, departing from Beijing's preferred phraseology of the Taiwan authorities or Taiwan region of China. The PRC read this as backing separatism, and it worried the US might support formal independence. Although Lee had trimmed Taiwan's military, he had tightened defence ties with Washington, including a sale of 150 F-16s. PLA generals who tended to sit on the conservative left of Chinese politics were particularly furious, while the right of the CPC and Ministry of Foreign Affairs urged caution so as not to disrupt normalisation. In the end, a compromise was reached. China would conduct exercises to demonstrate its capability to strike Taiwan if it formally separated. On July 21, 1995, the PLA 2nd Artillery Corps fired 2 Dongfeng 15 ballistic missiles into an area north of Taiwan. The next day, it fired 2 closer to the important port of Keelung, and 2 more the day after that. Beijing signalled the tests were theatre, quietly telling Washington and Taipei as much. On the final day, it staged a mock landing on Dongshan Island to showcase its amphibious capability. The White House initially didn't protest, furious at Lee for provoking the crisis in the first place. Sensing a potential wedge between Taipei and Washington, Jiang Zemin floated an official US visit in August, but the White House, wary of the PRC's unpopularity among voters, offered only an informal working visit. Tensions stayed high into 1996 as the PLA mobilised its roughly 100,000 troops on the Fujian coast opposite Taiwan. With Taiwan's first free elections approaching and the initial drills having drawn little response, the PLA set new exercises for March 1996. Chinese relations with the US had soured in the intervening months over alleged Chinese aid to Pakistan's nuclear program and, of all things, disputes over CD piracy that angered the US entertainment industry, with Congress threatening $3 billion in sanctions. When the missile tests began on March 8, 2 weeks before the vote, the splash zones were nearer major ports, spiking insurance rates and forcing closures. Amphibious drills ran on Haitan Island, chosen for its terrain akin to Taiwan's beaches. This time, Washington reacted at once. Perry issued threats and urged moving carrier groups towards the strait. War planning was conducted as the carriers Independence and Nimitz approached, observing the PLA exercises. The outcome of the crisis was mixed. Beijing claimed success, but if the aim was to dampen separatism, it failed. Polls instead showed polarisation. Both pro-independence and pro-reunification sentiment rose, and Lee's vote share increased. If the aim was to display strength, facing off against 2 US carriers only highlighted the PLA's inability to deal with such threats. If it was to drive a wedge between Taipei and Washington, that backfired spectacularly, with the US stepping up defence aid. The gains were mainly military. The PLA gained experience and arguments for new procurement programs. With the USSR gone, China finally regained access to Russia's arms market, and it promptly sought assets intended for use against advanced opponents, Su-30 fighters, Sovremeny-class missile destroyers, and Kilo-class submarines, to name a few. These would form part of the foundation for one of the largest and most successful military modernisation programs in history. In the long run, however, events favoured the mainland more clearly. Economic integration with Taiwan continued despite the crisis, even as Taiwanese nationalism grew. By the 2000s, PRC relations with Washington improved, and for a time it even appeared to be moving towards close cooperation under Hu Jintao. CPC market liberalisation had convinced many in the West that China was seeing a kind of Gorbachev moment, and that the Chinese party state might not be long for this world. Although peaceful reunification with Taiwan would prove more distant a prospect than ever by the 2010s and 2020s, by the time China faced another cross-strait crisis, it had another 20 years of technological transfer and military build-up that meant it would at least have a fighting chance in the event of a future war over the first island chain. Thanks for watching. This was originally part 1 of a nearly 5-hour video on the third Taiwan Strait crisis going hot in October 1995, linked to the full version below. But several viewers suggested cutting it up into smaller, more digestible pieces that could also be viewed on their own. The next video in this series covers the question of how PRC and ROC relations in the 1990s could have gotten worse, what political goals both sides pursued, what forces they had at their disposal, and what operational plans might have been drawn up for war. Whether you're here for the full Old History series or just out of historical interest, I hope you enjoyed the video.